We already divided the house, Claire. You were never here anyway, consider it settled. My brother said those words the same way he'd say he ordered the wrong pizza. Casual, unbothered. Like the home our parents spent 30 years paying off was a minor administrative detail he'd handled while I wasn't looking. He was leaning against the doorframe of his new kitchen, the one his wife had just had custom fitted with quartz countertops, and he didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye when he said it. I had driven 11 hours from Minneapolis to Dayton the moment I got the voicemail from the county assessor's office, a routine notification about a property transfer. I didn't understand what it meant at first. I played the message 3 times in a gas station parking lot outside of Bloomington before it registered. The house on Maple Creek Drive, the one where I grew up, the one where my mother kept a garden along the back fence and my father watched football from the same armchair for 27 years, it had been sold 6 months ago. And my name was on the deed transfer. Except I had never signed anything. My brother's name was Daniel. He was 4 years older than me, the kind of older brother who'd always been fluent in the language of I know best. When our parents passed, first our mother, 18 months ago from a stroke, then our father just 8 months after, like he simply didn't know how to exist without her. I had been the one who fell apart quietly. Daniel had stepped into the role of executor with efficiency that, at the time, I mistook for strength. I was grieving. I was 3 states away. I trusted him. That was my first mistake, and I would spend the next 4 months learning just how expensive that mistake had been. Daniel's wife was named Renata. She had big ambitions and a very specific vision of what her life was supposed to look like, and somewhere along the way, my parents' house and the $240,000 it sold for had become the foundation of that vision. She had always wanted to open a restaurant. A farm-to-table concept in the revitalized downtown strip, the kind of place with Edison bulbs and a chalkboard menu and appetizers that cost $16. The grand opening was already scheduled. I found the Facebook event page the night I arrived in Dayton. I confronted Daniel that evening at his house. He didn't deny the sale. He didn't even pretend to be surprised I'd found out. What he denied was that he'd done anything wrong. You hadn't been home in 2 years, Claire, he said, his voice carrying that particular brand of patience men use when they want you to feel unreasonable. Mom and Dad both knew you had your own life up there. They talked to me. They wanted the restaurant to happen. This was their wish. Then why is my signature on the transfer documents? I asked. I never signed anything, Daniel. He looked at me for a long moment, then picked up his coffee mug. You're grieving, you're confused. We had a family meeting last March, and you agreed to everything over the phone. I was in Minneapolis last March, there was no phone call. Claire. He sighed. You need to let this go. This is what they wanted. The restaurant is going to be something beautiful, something that honors them. Renata has already named a dish after Mom. Let us do this. I left without saying another word. I sat in my car in his driveway for 20 minutes, my hands shaking on the wheel. I wasn't confused. I wasn't overcome with grief. I was absolutely certain of one thing. I had never agreed to anything. My name had been used without my knowledge, my signature had been forged. And my inheritance, the only tangible thing my parents had left me, had been handed over to fund my sister-in-law's dream of serving artisanal cheese boards to Dayton's upper middle class. The next morning, I called the county recorder's office and requested a copy of the deed transfer documents. Then, I called a real estate attorney. She was a sharp woman named Patricia, and she reviewed the documents over a video call with the focus of someone who'd seen this particular crime before. The signature on the notarized transfer consent, she said, enlarging her screen, is you? No, I said. That's not my signature. You have documentation of where you were on the date this was notarized? I have work emails, a lease renewal I signed that same week, credit card statements. I was in Minneapolis. I have never been to the notary office listed on this document. Patricia was quiet for a moment. This is forgery, Claire. Potentially wire fraud, depending on how the funds moved. I want you to gather everything bank records if you can access them, any emails Daniel sent you about the estate, your own location records for the dates on these documents. Before you confront anyone else, I need you to stop talking to your brother entirely." I agreed. I hung up and made a very specific kind of decision, the kind that feels like dropping a match near dry grass. I was going to be careful. I was going to be methodical. And I was not going to show a single card until every card I had could end this. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Daniel and Renata would move against me once they realized I wasn't going away. Within a week of my conversation with Daniel, I began receiving messages from relatives. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in 3 years sent a long Facebook message about how hard Daniel had worked to manage the estate while I was absent. A cousin I'd grown up close to called me and gently suggested I was processing grief in a destructive way. My father's brother, Uncle Roy, who used to take me fishing every summer, sent a single text: "Think carefully before you damage this family over money." Daniel had gotten to all of them first. He was efficient, I'd give him that. Then my employer received an email. I was a project manager at a mid-sized logistics firm, and someone had sent HR a forwarded message chain allegedly from me to Daniel in which I accused him of deliberately hastening our father's death by withholding medication, and threatened to go to the police unless he paid me. The language was erratic, paranoid, nothing like anything I had ever written. My HR director called me into a video meeting, her expression carefully neutral, and asked me to explain the emails. "I didn't write those," I said, hearing the faint echo of how desperate that sounds when you're the one saying it. "Your name is on the account," she said. "Someone created a spoofed address. I can show you the header data. The sending domain is off by 1 letter." She was thoughtful enough to look, and careful enough to not fire me outright. But I was placed on a 2-week administrative review. They said it was standard procedure. The message was clear. My credibility was now in question. I went back to my apartment and sat on the floor of my living room for a long time. Not because I was breaking down, though I wanted to, but because I needed to think clearly about what was happening. Daniel wasn't just covering his tracks, he was building a case. He was constructing a version of me, unstable, estranged, making wild accusations out of grief and greed. If I went to the authorities before I had ironclad proof, I would look like exactly what he was painting me as. I needed something concrete. Something that couldn't be explained away. I spent 3 weeks going through everything I had access to. The estate records Patricia had pulled. The timeline of the property sale. Daniel's social media, which was surprisingly useful. There were photos from the day the house sold that he'd posted with a caption about new beginnings, which I screenshotted along with the metadata. I filed a formal records request for all notarized documents connected to my parents' estate. I contacted the notary listed on the transfer documents, a man named Gerald Fossey, and left a message. He never called back, which told me something. I also hired a forensic document analyst through Patricia. She sent him the transfer consent bearing my forged signature alongside 24 authentic signatures of mine from contracts, lease agreements, forms from the past 5 years. His report came back in 10 days. His conclusion was unambiguous: the signature on the transfer document was not mine. The pen pressure, the letterform construction, the natural variation pattern, none of it matched. Someone had practiced my signature, but not enough times. It was a start, it wasn't enough. Then, Renata made a mistake. She was meticulous about her restaurant's public image, posting updates almost daily to her Instagram and the restaurant's Facebook page. Progress photos, vendor meetings, soft launch previews. She was proud of this project, and she wanted everyone to know it. What she forgot, or perhaps never considered, was that my father had added me to his iCloud family sharing account 2 years ago so I could help him troubleshoot his phone remotely. He'd never removed me. After he died, the account had stayed active, suspended in digital amber, still tied to his old iPad that Daniel hadn't bothered to wipe. I don't know what made me check it. Some instinct, maybe, or just the methodical habit of checking every door to see if any of them were unlocked. I logged in with my father's credentials one evening. I still had them saved from when I'd helped him recover his Apple ID, and the photos library loaded. Most of it was what you'd expect. Family photos, screenshots of news articles my father had found interesting, pictures of his garden. But near the end of the library, in the months before he died, there was a folder I didn't recognize. Auto-synced from a device that had been connected to his account. Daniel had logged into Dad's iCloud on his own phone at some point, probably to transfer contacts or photos after Dad passed, and had forgotten to disconnect. Which meant that for several months, certain items from Daniel's camera roll had been quietly, automatically backing up to my father's cloud account, including photographs of documents. I found them on a Thursday night, sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of tea that went cold while I scrolled. There were 7 photos, taken over 2 separate sessions, of what appeared to be estate documents spread across Daniel's kitchen table. One showed the deed transfer form with a practice sheet beside it, lines of signature attempts, getting closer and closer to my handwriting with each row. Another showed a text message exchange between Daniel and Renata, in which she wrote, "Does it look right? Will it hold up?" And he replied, "Gerald says yes. He's done this before, stop worrying." There was a photo of the check. $240,000, made out to a holding company for the restaurant, deposited 11 days after the sale closed. I sat very still for a very long time. I forwarded everything to Patricia that night with a message that just said, "I found it." She called me at 7 the next morning. "Claire," she said, and I could hear something in her voice I hadn't heard before, not just professionalism, but genuine, careful excitement. "This is significant. The practice signature sheet alone is damning. Combined with the forensic analysis and the text messages, we have a strong case for forgery, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty." She paused. "The notary is also potentially liable. Gerald Fossey didn't just make an error, those texts imply he knowingly certified a fraudulent document." We went to the county district attorney's office the following week. Patricia came with me and laid everything out, the forensic report, the iCloud photos, the timeline discrepancies, my documented location records from the date of the supposed notarization. The assistant DA who met with us was a tired-looking man who perked up considerably as the folder got thicker. "The notary," he said, tapping the text message printout. "We'll want to talk to Gerald Fossey." "He never returned my call," I said. "He'll return ours," the assistant DA said. It turned out Gerald Fossey had done this before the text message had suggested as much, and it was true. 2 other cases in 2 other counties. He was not going to be a problem. He was going to be the easiest part of this, because the moment investigators showed up at his door, he made the decision that his notary license and his freedom were worth more than his loyalty to a man who had used him as a tool and moved on. He gave them a written statement within 48 hours. I didn't tell Daniel any of this was happening. I went back to Minneapolis, back to work, after my administrative review cleared, and I waited. Patricia told me to be patient. The DA's office moved at their own pace. I focused on rebuilding the things Daniel had tried to dismantle: my professional reputation, my relationships with the few relatives who hadn't already taken his side, my own sense of stability. I also watched the restaurant's Facebook page. The grand opening was announced for a Saturday in October. Harvest and grace, an evening of farm-to-table excellence. Ticket price, $85 a person. 120 guests on the RSVP list. Renata had put together an entire slideshow presentation about the restaurant's origins, a tribute to family, she called it, a legacy built on love. There was a section about my parents. Their photos, their story, the house on Maple Creek Drive. She had made my mother and father into the origin myth of a restaurant that was built on stolen money, and she was going to stand in front of a room full of people and say it with a straight face. I drove back to Dayton 2 days before the opening. Patricia told me the arrest warrants had been issued that morning. The DA's office had coordinated with local law enforcement and would be executing them on Saturday. I asked if I could be there. She said that was my choice to make, and she didn't recommend it, and then she didn't say anything else when I said I was going. I had one thing to do before Saturday. I reached out to a woman named Sylvia, who was handling the restaurant's opening night audiovisual setup. I'd found her through the event's Facebook page, where she was tagged as the evening's event coordinator. I told her I was Daniel's sister, that I had a surprise tribute prepared for the opening, a personal video honoring my parents that I wanted to include in the slideshow. I asked if I could bring a USB drive with the file. She said that was a lovely idea. Saturday evening, I wore the black dress I had bought for my mother's funeral. I thought she would have appreciated the symmetry. The restaurant was warm and softly lit when I arrived, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look like they're having the best night of their lives. Renata had done a beautiful job with the space, I'll give her that. There were white tablecloths, small vases of dahlias on every table, a long bar with local craft beers, and an autumn cocktail menu. The guests were dressed well and talking loudly and holding glasses of wine, and the whole room had the particular energy of something that feels like it's beginning. Daniel saw me from across the room. I watched his face go through several things very quickly, surprise, then calculation, then a performance of calm authority. He crossed the floor toward me with his hands in his pockets, smiling in that way that was meant to look relaxed and wasn't. "Claire," he said. "You shouldn't be here." "It's a public event," I said. I RSVP'd. "You need to leave." His voice was lower now, the smile dropping. "I don't know what you think you're going to do here, but this is Renata's night, and I'm not letting you." "I brought a tribute video," I said. "For Mom and Dad. Sylvia already has the drive." Something moved behind his eyes. He reached out and put his hand on my arm. "I'm asking you, as your brother, to walk out that door right now, before you do something you can't take back." "Daniel," I said, and I was surprised by how even my voice was, how absolutely still I felt. I found the practice sheet. I found the texts with Gerald. I found the check. The hand on my arm went rigid. "I found all of it," I said, "in Dad's iCloud, which you forgot to disconnect from." He didn't say anything. He didn't move. I watched him understand, in real time, that the careful structure he had spent months building had a hole in it he'd never seen coming: an old iPad, an autosync setting, a daughter who knew her father's Apple ID. "The DA's office has everything," I said. "This isn't me threatening you. This is me telling you, because you're my brother, and I thought you deserved to know before." I didn't finish the sentence, because the front doors of the restaurant opened and 4 people walked in who were not dressed for dinner. Renata was in the middle of the room, mid-laugh with a group of guests, when she saw them. I watched the laugh stop and something else take its place. A recognition, the kind that comes with guilt, the instant understanding of what the presence of those particular people in that particular space means. She looked at Daniel. He was still standing next to me, very still, like a man who has just heard the sound of ice cracking beneath his feet and knows there is nothing to do now but go down. The lead investigator walked over to him. They spoke quietly. Daniel nodded once, a strange mechanical motion, and then he looked at me with an expression I hadn't expected. Not rage, not defiance, but something that looked almost like relief. Like a person who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been permitted to set it down. Renata was not quiet about it. She made a scene that the guests would likely talk about for years, not the kind of scene that earned sympathy, but the panicked, cornered kind, the accusations flying in every direction, her voice rising above the background music until someone turned it off and the whole room went silent. I stood near the edge of the bar and didn't say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. Daniel and Renata were escorted out through the front door of the restaurant she had built with my parents' money, while 120 people watched over the tops of their wine glasses. I found Sylvia near the AV booth, looking shell-shocked. "I'm sorry about the evening," I told her. She looked at me for a moment and then said, very quietly, "Did they really forge your signature?" "Yes," I said. She shook her head slowly. "The tribute video, do you actually want to play it?" "No," I said, "that was just to get in the door." She almost smiled. "Fair enough." I sat down at a table near the window and ordered one of the autumn cocktails. It was a good cocktail, bourbon and apple cider, and something with a smoky finish. I drank it slowly and looked out at the street and thought about my parents. About the house on Maple Creek Drive, which was someone else's home now and would be forever. About my mother's garden and whether the new owners had kept it or torn it out. About my father's armchair, which Daniel had probably sold along with everything else. The things I had lost were still lost. The money, when it was eventually recovered from the seized assets of the restaurant and the holding company, would cover some of what was taken, Patricia told me later, perhaps not all of it, given the legal costs and the way these recoveries worked. But a significant portion. The house itself could not be undone. That was a grief I would sit with. But I had not let them write the ending. That mattered to me more than I had expected. Gerald Fossey accepted a plea deal and testified against Daniel in detail. The forensic evidence was so clean that Daniel's attorney advised him not to go to trial. He pled guilty to forgery, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. His sentence was 4 years. Renata, who had known and participated in the planning, received 2 years and a substantial fine. The restaurant was shuttered before it ever served a single dinner to a paying customer. Harvest and Grace lasted approximately 45 minutes on the night of its opening, which, when I think about it, is probably the most honest review it ever received. The relatives who had sent me those careful, concerned messages about damaging the family did not reach out afterward. Not to apologize, not to check in, not to acknowledge what had happened. Uncle Roy, who had warned me to think carefully before causing damage, was notably silent. I stopped waiting for it. Some people, I've come to understand, build their loyalty to whoever is standing in front of them, and they'll rebuild it again the next time the room rearranges itself. I don't have the energy to earn the loyalty of people like that. The ones worth keeping found me without much effort. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years called me 2 weeks after the arrest. She'd seen the news, it had made a local paper, enough to reach people who knew the family. "I'm sorry I didn't call sooner," she said. "I should have asked you directly instead of listening to his version. We had dinner over the holidays. It was a small thing, but it felt like the beginning of something real. I stayed in Minneapolis. I had a good job and an apartment I liked and a life I had built entirely on my own, and I found that after everything, I wanted that life even more than I had before, not because I had anything left to prove, but because I had finally, fully understood that it was mine. It had never required anyone else's permission or blessing or approval to be valid. I had just spent years of my life not quite believing that. I visited Dayton in the spring and drove past the house on Maple Creek Drive. A young family lived there now. There was a basketball hoop in the driveway and a plastic playhouse in the side yard and wind chimes on the front porch that my mother would have liked. I parked on the opposite side of the street for a few minutes and looked at it. The maple tree out front was already green with new leaves. The garden along the back fence was gone, replaced with sod, but there was a flower box in the front window with yellow pansies in it. I didn't feel the thing I had expected to feel, which was loss. Or not only loss, I felt something quieter and more specific, a kind of completion. Like closing a book at the end rather than in the middle. Some debts are paid in courtrooms. Some are paid in the long, slow work of continuing to exist well, of not becoming something diminished by what was done to you. I am still working on the second kind. I expect I will be for a while. But I know where I live, and I know what's mine, and I know the difference between the two, which is more than Daniel ever figured out, and more, I think, than he ever will.